Hello, dear casuals. This is Emanuel Dostoevsky. Thanks to Switch and Board, our guest today is John Scott-Railton, a senior researcher at the Citizens Lab. We had a great conversation on digital security, surveillance, disinformation, and the misuse of COVID-related technologies. I hope you enjoy it.
So my name is John Scott-Railton, and I'm a senior researcher at the Citizen Lab, which is a research group at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. The Citizen Lab has been around since the early 2000s, and our work focuses on tracking digital threats to civil society. So this means online censorship, this means attempts at hacking, and this also means invasive laws that permit the surveillance of journalists and human rights defenders and political movements. So I've been working at the lab for almost a decade, and during that time, we've been tracking the way that there's been sort of an explosion of the industry of companies selling tracking products to governments to track their citizens. And of course, whenever you get an explosion of a new technology, it's going to get abused. And so a lot of our time is spent discovering the many ways that this technology gets abused, not to track criminals, not to track terrorists, but to track reporters, food scientists, anybody who's potentially upset someone powerful.
So these are the people you call $1,000,000 dissidents, right, in this report, because they spend so much time and energy, these governments or powers that be, on tracking them, silencing them.
You know, it's hard, I think. Most people wonder, like, what is the measure of my life? And how do I know if I've had any impact? And I submit to you that this is actually a really good measure that you've had some impact, which is a government is willing to pay for a really expensive tool in order to track you. It may not be the most intuitive measure, but you can probably wear it as a badge of pride.
In your bio, it says, once upon a time, neuropharmacology, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, well, how did this switch happen?
Well, it's a great story. When I was an undergraduate and beyond, I was really interested in the mechanics of addiction, especially addictive behaviors. And so I did some work and published some papers on the brain biology of addiction. And the most interesting part of this is that I had to figure out how to teach rats to become gamblers, which I succeeded at.
Can they give it up, or they get completely addicted?
Well, just like us, right? It's awfully hard to give it up. But what I was trying to understand was actually a really interesting problem, which is, why is it that we are susceptible to drugs of addiction? It's not enough to just say, well, the drug is addictive. The question is, what basic neurological mechanism is this drug hijacking? What signal is the drug sending that then causes our behavior to be stuck on something? And so part of what we wanted to do was to find addictions that didn't have any drugs involved, and then to show that inside the brain, they were extremely similar to an addiction to drugs. So this allowed us to then say, okay, the basis is the same. And then the question is, well, if we can get the basis the same without a drug, maybe that's the system that the drugs are hijacking.
But I think the maximum effect of this drug-like behavior happens in the face of uncertainty. So you're not really sure just before, let's say, the dice is being rolled.
So it's really interesting, and uncertainty is a big part of it. It turns out that our brains are really bad at making good guesses about probability. And so the classic experiment from the biology of addiction is you take pigeons and you separate them into two groups. And one group of pigeons gets an average of 5 pellets for every 20 presses on a little lever. But the pellets come at random times. The other group of pigeons get the same 5 pellets, but it's, whatever it would be, every 4 presses. It turns out that when you stop giving them pellets, the pigeons that have been getting pellets regularly, that can predict when they're going to get the pellets, after a bunch of presses, they're like, you know what? Fuck this. We're done, right? We're going to stop pressing. But the pigeons who are getting those pellets in an unpredictable way, they press that lever until they fall asleep. And that is the basis of, for many people, addiction, which is intermittent reinforcement intermittent in timing and intermittent in quantity, is a tremendously powerful tool for turning a mammal into a little addicted creature.
What was the connection from this to protecting the dissidents?
Well, it's obvious, no? So it went through some iterations, but it ended up with me working on the effects of climate change in West Africa. And while I was doing this work, I realized that something really interesting was happening in Egypt. And I had lived in Egypt before. And what was interesting, of course, was what was happening in 2011.
Right.
And what I began to feel was, I'm using social media to follow what's going on, to keep in touch with my old friends. But I'm hearing that the internet is going to be shut down. So maybe there's something I can do to address this problem. And so I built 2 projects, one for Egypt and then later for Libya, called the Voices Project, based on getting around the internet shutdowns in those countries. While running those projects, a big part of it was phone calls to people on the street, people who could be verified and who would provide information, kind of like a network of citizen journalists. Mm-hmm. And this was a very powerful thing during that time when the government was trying to prevent information from coming back. And you can't necessarily put the internet back into a place, but you can still use the internet to get the voices of these people out to the world. During the course of that work, especially on Libya, I began to realize that the Libyan government was hacking the people who I was talking to. And when you talk to a person, you're a journalist and a reporter, when you have a conversation with a person anonymously and you say, okay, I won't tell people your name, that's like a guarantee that you can make to them. But if their phone is already hacked, you can't really make that guarantee. And so the question is, ethically, are you in a position to really offer them privacy and confidentiality? And that became such an interesting problem to me that I decided to focus on it. And here we are almost 10 years later.
Well, this is basically by accident almost. As far as I understand, you were literally just calling them and tweeting on their behalf, right? So they would tell you and then you would tweet theirs.
Yeah, and there was an element of verification. So for important parts, the goal was to get in touch with people who were also in the same area or location, especially in Tahrir and other areas where things were happening, so that it wouldn't just be one person's perspective. So to try to add an element of, again, citizen journalism verification.
So let's then come to today, the most urgent, let's say, project that you're working on. And then we can work our way back.
At the end of the day, right, like we all want to step outside and eat messy sandwiches and handle doorknobs and, maybe touch strangers. But the problem, of course, is that we can't do that right now. Although we're all sort of having the same experience and the coronavirus crisis has minted 1 billion new amateur epidemiologists, not everyone is engaged in the same enterprise. And there are companies that we have been tracking for years because they sell spy tools, who have kind of emerged onto the market and now say that they're selling coronavirus tracking. And so we're spending time trying to understand, what are these companies selling? Are these products even legitimate? And we're doing broader research as well into the ecosystem of companies and entities that are selling location data. One of the things that's the most interesting to me, if you read newspapers like at the end of last year, 2019, and doesn't that seem like a lifetime ago, you would read all these stories about reporters really concerned about the abuse of location data. Mm-hmm. So big exposés, the shadowy companies using location data from app-based advertising, selling your data. Fast forward to March, and the New York Times did a really big piece using exactly that data to show people's movements around the coronavirus and to try to talk about the effect of social distancing. So one of my great anxieties is that we were moving towards a place of accountability and concern around the use and abuse of location data. And suddenly, we've kind of put all that to the side and said, well, look, this is a crisis and we have to make certain choices during a crisis. My concern as a student of history is that often when you make certain choices during a crisis, it's very hard to undo those choices. When you set up a state of emergency, for example, and create certain other precedents, those things become sticky and it's awfully hard for them to leave. And I worry that the same problem is going to repeat itself with location tracking and coronavirus. will bring in these technologies for the stated goal of helping people get back to their everyday life. But pretty quickly, intelligence and police services and others will decide, actually, we like this level of visibility into these citizens, and we're going to find a quiet way to keep a version of it going.
So one of the things that was really fascinating to me about those journalism pieces, New York Times specifically, is that before that, I was thinking, well, all of this data is anonymized. It's kind of like Google. And because it's anonymized, it might be useful. I like to live in that world where, I can, technology helps me. And as long as they can figure out the traffic patterns, for security purposes, for whatever purposes, infrastructure purposes, that's great. But then that piece, after reading that, I realized that it's so easy to match names, actual names and identity information to that kind of location data, that it is dishonest to market it as anonymized data.
Exactly. So a couple of years ago, I did some research into fitness trackers, and I called the phenomenon fit leaking. So basically, people would post their fitness tracker tracks of their exercise. Look at me, I've had this great run. See, I begin in my house, right? And then I go for a run, and then I maybe forget to turn it off, and I finish at work. And what I was able to show is that these tracks that people were uploading, feeling like they were being fairly anonymous, were actually doing things like showing the homes of people, but also identifying the people who worked at the CIA or the spies who were jogging in circles at the Russian embassy in Damascus. And it became clear in that moment to me that location data is never something that exists within inside a vacuum. It's just designed to be combined with other data. And as soon as it's combined, it's de-anonymized. And so even if someone tells you, look, we'd like to collect anonymized location data, functionally, it's never really that the data itself is anonymous. It's just that in that one moment, there's an indicator that might not be associated with your name. This actually, I think, is the bigger story about privacy in general, which is we, as we travel around the internet, are emitting a constant digital exhaust. The thing is, that exhaust is most useful when it's combined with other pieces of information about us, when our browsing patterns are combined with our credit card history, when the television that we view on our smart TV is combined with our search terms. And there's an entire industry that makes its primary business the recombination of these disparate threads of data. And who are their clients? Well, of course, it's marketers who want a perfect picture, who want to know, if I show this person an advertisement on the YouTube at his parents' house, is he going to go ahead and buy my thing through Amazon.com? But there's another set of clients too, which is banks, insurance companies, and others who want to decide whether a person is what they would consider a good risk. And then you also have the most troubling use of this, which is people who do surveillance for governments and who sell surveillance and intelligence products have realized, my God, this is like an NSA in a box. We should buy this data too.
Let's actually focus on that journey of that data. When I emit this digital exhaust through my phone or my online behavior, where does that data sit? Again, referring to those articles, I thought before reading that it's just in these big companies, sitting in big companies like Google, Amazon, whatever. They are saying that, no, actually, there are all these smaller companies that are collecting your location information. You haven't even heard of them, but they have all this information.
Most of the apps that you download, if you're like an Android user, for example, show you ads. Well, most of those apps, depending on their permissions, have access to information about your phone, whether it's what other Wi-Fi devices your phone sees or your phone's location, other things that you do on that phone. And those advertising companies use that data not only to show you things, but actually to siphon the data back and then turn it into a product that can then be sold, creating these highly accurate digital profiles of you. And so you're right. We tend to think of it as, am I private from Google? Am I private from Apple? And it's important because obviously Google, for example, can see many different parts of you at the same time. But this doesn't prevent the, scooter sharing app that you've got on your phone from also working with 6 or 7 different small advertising tracker firms that then market that data and turn it into valuable product for somebody else. So for example, imagine I'm using, say, a scooter share, right? A little bike share. That data can be used to market things to me based on where I go to shop, right? You can then combine it with credit card data and figure out what kind of a purchaser I am. But you can also use it to decide, well, did the billboard that I bought, was it really in the right place? Am I likely to put my pictures in front of people? These are all really interesting questions. And it's the kind of question that makes marketers dream. The flip side, though, of all of this is that it's not always as accurate as the people selling it, or of course marketers, would like you to think. And so you have two problems. On the one hand, it is tremendously invasive data. But on the other hand, it's not really an accurate sample of a population. For example, we know that smartphone use is very different among different demographics. It matches differences in level of education, level of salary and income, racial and ethnic background, and age, among many other variables. For that reason, data that is used about a population that comes out of this data is going to systematically overcount some groups and undercount other groups. And so even as people look at this data and say, wow, this could be used in times of coronavirus to really do something exceptional, it's like, yes, and we'll also not know about many of the demographics that are at the highest risk for coronavirus.
So there are many limitations to use this technology for coronavirus, but just because it gets the headlines right now, I guess. And I'm wondering if you think that's kind of a Trojan horse for some companies to, get themselves in or their products in to probably install more permanent surveillance systems.
I think the answer is absolutely. My sense is that people who are in the business of tracking and doing location monitoring, whether it's spies and companies who sell to spies or somewhat questionable marketing companies, have hidden under a kind of a large rock from the public for years because they know just how scary and invasive the God's eye view data that they collect looks. And in the times when they've done and when they've gone and shown it in the past few years, the backlash is enormous. Suddenly, COVID has flipped that rock over, and these folks are discovering, hey, we can kind of brag about the data that we're collecting, and people are going to pat us on the back. My favorite example is a location tracking company was tracking a conference, and they wanted to say, okay, there was some coronavirus exposure at this conference. Where did it go? So they used their advertising data. They figured out everybody who went to that conference. They then tracked their phones as they flew home. They then identified the other phones and devices that were co-located with those phones and then tracked them. And you can see people driving on roads and so on. They published this as a map. A year ago, this would have been like, my God, who are these private spies figuring out the identities of everybody who attends a political conference in the United States and tracking them to their houses? Now the response is, oh, great. Now we can really see how to track this problem.
Yeah.
It isn't just the sort of unscrupulous spies, though, who are selling this stuff. So I got quoted in a newspaper recently referring to the desperation that we're experiencing and how cynical companies are taking advantage of this. And so I said, we're just looking for somebody who will offer us hope. And the first thing that happened is I got a message in my email from a guy selling another security product saying, John, you were asking for hope. Well, here it is. Give me a call and let me demo my project. Unbelievable.
It's like a nightmare.
This is the episode of Black Mirror that I missed last season, but I feel like I keep watching every day.
It's actually even worse than that because the second level to this is that they are actually openly marketing this to governments, whether it's local or federal. And then the governments are not trying to hide this. Like they're using this as, hey, this is how we are dealing with the virus.
And norms are powerful. So up until this point, the conversation has really been, what is the danger of these technologies? This particular technology, how invasive is it? How privacy problematic it is? These are all great questions, but there's a bigger question which has to do with how we talk about things. In any situation, we find this intuitive. If a teacher, for example, doesn't discipline a bully in a classroom, that behavior will be mirrored by other students. If the rhetoric of a president or a leader is violent, that rhetoric will be mirrored, and it will take years for that violent discourse to go away. I worry about that as perhaps one of the longest tales of the coronavirus pandemic, which is this transformation in how acceptable it is to be collecting and trafficking in this kind of location data. Now, it may be the case that the other thing will happen, that people will have the personal experience of being tracked, discover that the tracking didn't work very well, perhaps, or feel invaded and want to push back. I'm just not sure which way that it will cut right now. I think for the moment, the industry that does surveillance and tracking is like, finally, civil society has basically disappeared as an opponent to us, and we can have really whatever free reign we want.
It is difficult to predict now, in my opinion, to see which way it's going to go. But the other thing you said, this goes back to something you said previously. If the governments have this power, or if at least in the public perception that threshold is already exceeded, that okay, it's the government's right. It's like entropy. It's always it always increases the government's power.
It is a little bit like entropy, and it's this way in a couple of senses. So there are some rights that when you give them up, you can then go back and take them back. So for example, the right to go outside. At some point, we're just going to go outside and then we'll have that back again. We'll have the being outside right back again. The issue with privacy is that it's different. Once elements of your privacy are out there, you can't put them back. It's like a person who becomes a public figure. They can't become private again. And what concerns me is that the volume of data about all of us that will be sloshing around and pushed to all these improbable places and used in all these ways that may be very problematic, that can't go back. That it's like a breach more than, some kind of a temporary problem. In many cases of like investigations that we run at the Citizen Lab into hackers and malware, sometimes very old postings from people who later do bad things are tremendously useful in tracking them down. Somebody's, engagement picture posted 10 years ago, in one case, actually helped me identify a particular hacker.
From my perspective, it kind of diverges into two separate fields, let's say. One is that with this power and technology, what's going to happen to our democratic processes? What's going to happen to communication, social media? And the other thing is more targeted surveillance-related issues, which is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was your original research goal, that to focus on these people, high-risk individuals specifically targeted.
Our research tends to focus on people in civil society. But my conclusion from years of doing it is that these are, and I don't know what the expression in Turkish would be, but these are the canaries in the coal mine. In many cases, the things that we see targeting these groups, it's the same that everyone else will face just in future years. In a sense, I think what's been interesting about our research is that we've been studying for years the impact of location tracking and surveillance on high-risk people. What we're now discovering is that many of the things that we saw as the harms to those people are now risks to a general population from this kind of tracking and surveillance. And that's exceptionally concerning for me. I feel very strongly it is likely that we will need to use certain kinds of technologies to help us crawl out of this pandemic. Maybe it's tracking, maybe it's epidemiological-based modeling, and we're going to need to use some kinds of things that will involve monitoring the movements of people. If a society decides to do that, they have to do it in a way that has transparency, and the companies that they bring in have to be totally unimpeachable and have to be accountable legally to the jurisdictions where they operate. And what scares me the most is that in fear and a rush to show efficacy, governments are ignoring all of that and opening doors that they don't have the tools to close. And I think what concerns me the most is that politicians have never been particularly well educated about the risks associated with technology unless they themselves are the victim of a hack or a disinformation campaign. And what concerns me is that politicians are moving very quickly, making lots of executive-style decisions about tracking, but the things that they're being told about what the tracking can do are often wrong. In many cases, when we've looked at proposals around tracking technology, when I've looked at these proposals, it turns out that the technologies couldn't really perform as claimed. So even if they couldn't discover whether or not a person has a high risk of getting coronavirus, they can perform for other purposes, like tracking people for intelligence things. And I think once you buy a company's technology like that and you bring it in, if it doesn't work for thing A, there's going to be a strong tendency for the security services to say, well, maybe we can use it for thing B, but don't tell anyone.
Right. I read these and watched your $1 Million Dissident YouTube video. It was really interesting, the techniques they were using, because it's really sophisticated and time consuming, right? So, but now you're saying that they don't have to spend $1 million anymore. They can just do this, cents on the dollar probably for every one of us.
So there are different ways to target people. And the most expensive way, of course, in terms of time and effort and sophistication, is probably to hack your phone and then monitor you through your phone, becoming a digital spy in your pocket. But of course, that takes effort and resources, and somebody has to be pointed at you to do that. Mm-hmm. What's happening now with coronavirus tracking is kind of at the other extreme, which is the massive tracking of large groups of people. But the tracking that is being considered in many cases is based around the location of individuals, combined with other information like the health status of these individuals and their identities and their phone numbers and other ways of getting in touch with them. That becomes a perfect graph of who interacts with who talks to who's in a political movement, who works together, who's a coworker, who's a lover, who's a friend. That kind of information is exactly the information that underpins a society. It's information not about individuals, but about relationships. And it's why, in most societies, that is the most protected kind of information, because it's the most abusable. It's like a Pandora's box of possibilities for abuse. I can learn a tremendous amount about you by who you're standing near, by who you're in a car with, by who you share a minibus with, by who you're taking an Uber at night with, by where you spend your evenings. This kind of information is so sensitive and so private and so revealing. It needs to be protected. And what scares me is not that it could potentially be used to help us, because I think that it very well is the kind of thing that can be used to do things like contact tracing and the identification of possibilities of infection, but that it will be collected and reused and retransmitted and used by all sorts of people who want something from us, or who want to do something to us, or who want to understand us. And the other thing that people sometimes say, and I see it almost like a psychological defense mechanism, which is like, I'm not that interesting. What you say during a breakup was, look, it's not you, it's me, right? The thing about surveillance is it's not me, it's you. Anybody is as interesting as their most interesting contact, because your behavior can be used to find out information about people who are your friends, who you may work with, or who you work for. And so your privacy is not just really yours, it's community privacy. And once you start prying into that, you get very valuable information. It's no accident, for example, that when we were investigating around the case of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, we found that some of his closest contacts were targeted with a piece of spyware called Pegasus. Part of that idea, which is called off-center targeting in the intelligence world, is that you can often learn a lot about a person by listening to their friends and by tracking what their friends say about them and what they say to their friends. You don't need to target the person directly.
Right. So for the Turkish audience, this is Cemal Kaşıkçı. We use the Turkish version of the name. And so you're saying that his phone was not necessarily directly monitored, but it was his friends? So they reached him through?
We don't know publicly whether Jamal's phone was infected. But what we know at the Citizen Lab is that some of his closest confidants, including Omar Abdulaziz, who is a dissident of the Saudi regime based in Canada, who had been working very closely with Jamal, was targeted with Pegasus. And in fact, although we didn't learn it till later, we published an investigation showing that Omar was targeted with Pegasus. And I think it was the next day that Jamal was murdered. I think those two things are unrelated, but it shows how tightly connected surveillance can be and murder.
Actually, it's almost, we can think in terms of herd immunity. So instead of herd immunity for privacy.
Oh, I like this idea. Yeah. We are a herd and we infect each other as a herd. We also protect each other as a herd. And surveillance often seeks to target us and to understand us as a herd, because rarely is the objective of surveillance just learning about your private pornography habits. Mostly, it's about understanding who's important in a movement, who's important in a group, and then how to tear apart the social linkages that exist, how to introduce a vaccine of a very perverse kind to try to bring and pull apart social interactions.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, my mind immediately goes to these extreme cases or more juicy stories where, oh my God, they're going to find out my browsing history and then they're going to blackmail me using that. But that's actually very human intensive, let's say,
It's an egocentric way of understanding the objectives of surveillance. And it's a way that people can understand the invasiveness of it. But for the most part, as any IT person will tell you, everybody does things on the internet that they don't want their spouse or their friends to know about. This is normal. That's much less interesting in most cases than using information for other purposes. It doesn't mean, right, that there isn't catfishing and blackmail and all that. It just means that that's kind of like the cheap version.
Yeah, it's just the one that's most often portrayed in the movies. That's why we're familiar with it. And the other kind that you're talking about is not only more important, but it can actually be automated, it seems.
I could show you some graphics that I created based on tracking hacking groups targeting whole networks of thousands of people, and show you how they built these networks of people and then moved around inside the networks to get at their real targets and to monitor those individuals.
This scaling up brings me to this topic of messing with elections. There was a report you mentioned in 2017, one of your speeches, you were saying 48 countries showed evidence of systematic disinformation campaigns. 30 of those were about elections, and they were actually about domestic elections. So again, the first example that came to my mind was the big bad Russians attacking the American democracy, but actually a far greater threat is your own government using this domestically.
It's an interesting phenomenon. We know the most about the big fights of the big players, because just like in a superhero movie, right? When King Kong fights another monster, right? Like buildings get broken, so we hear about it. Yeah. But what we find as researchers is wherever we scratch, there are disinformation campaigns. Some of them are really sophisticated. Some of them are done by foreign entities, and some of them are totally domestic and local. I like to think of it like this. The internet is a laboratory for marketers, and online social platforms are the perfect way to market things, because you have a person, you can see what they're looking at, you can show them something, and you can then track whether showing them something results in a behavior. I like to think of disinformation as marketing. And the product is feeling, and the profit is behavior. And the internet is a perfect laboratory for conducting disinformation experimentation. You show people messages, you create feelings in them, but the ultimate goal is behavioral. And what's interesting is that if you think about it historically, it was very hard if you wanted to do global disinformation. You'd have to find some susceptible journalist in some disreputable magazine and then promote a story, right? Like it required this tremendous effort at dissemination. And even then, you had no idea whether anyone bought it, especially if you were doing it from abroad, pointing into a country. Now you can actually track down to the person the efficacy of your messaging and refine it. And I think it's fair to say the internet knows much more about some of our behaviors and our feelings than we do in certain situations. What scares me the most is, we've had this conversation about Russian disinformation. People have a mental image of a certain kind of disinformation. It's like false stories, misleading captions, lots of emojis, this kind of garbage. I'm actually less worried about that, and I'll tell you why. At the end of the day, disinformation and fake news are not the same thing. The reason is, if you apply my little framework, disinformation, marketing, product feeling, profit behavior, the internet is really good at being used to create feelings. And to get at that in different ways, you don't have to put a bunch of factual propositions that happen to be false in front of people and hope that they believe them. We know that social media companies have even done experiments on shifting the mood of people just by making minor tweaks in the totally factual information that people are shown, say, about their friends. What scares me is that as the operators doing marketing and disinformation, often it's the same people, become more sophisticated, they will learn ways to shape our feelings that can't be easily observed by researchers and by other people who say, well, that's obviously demonstrably false. Mm-hmm. What's the consequence of this? Well, imagine I can identify a targeted demographic who's going to vote. And for the week before, I use my marketing skills to show them material that's totally accurate, but that makes them feel less positive. If I can make a certain number of marginal voters less likely to go out and vote or less likely to speak publicly about something, I've achieved my goal. And I could potentially do it without creating a data trail that is as obvious as a bunch of badly photoshopped pictures of eagles with Donald Trump's face on them. My theory is that the conversation about fake news and news verification is actually something that people have settled on, in part because it makes a very scary problem feel very tractable. Also directs attention away from what the platforms really do, which is shape your feelings and your behavior, and move it towards the content, right? So as long as we talk about disinformation as content, then you can say, well, you need fact checking to solve that, right? But if disinformation is really just the manipulation of feelings to produce behaviors, how do you fact check that?
I always felt deep down inside that these fact-checking sites are kind of preaching to the choir.
I don't buy it. Have you ever smoked?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you smoke cigarettes that had a warning sign on the package?
Oh, no, I smoked other things. Sorry, I didn't smoke cigarettes. But I know.
Let me ask that question differently. Have you noticed that people around you who are very rational people smoke cigarettes from packages that have giant pictures of cancerous lungs?
Yes.
Okay. Information doesn't change behavior absent motivation. And the Marlboro man with a small warning in the lower corner, the message is clear. And I think your skepticism about fact checking is exactly right. I don't think that even in a situation where you're dealing with, the alleged highly rational information consumer, people are going to go to those little fact check things, right? Mm-hmm. For many reasons, including the fact that often the disinformation is bright, it's shiny, maybe it even blinks, right? It could be a video. There's a lot of interesting content. And then there's sort of a boring bar down at the bottom that warns you that the internet is not safe. I think that most people, when they navigate the internet, overestimate their ability to quickly see through disinformation, because you can see a lot of it. The result then is that we have a sort of a vision of our ability to sense what's going on and what's being done to us that may be more artisanal and less representative than we'd like to think.
We want to believe that there's an authority on, a final authority on truth. Internet and new social media does not have actually that stuff. It's almost like these parallel universes existing together with their own set of facts.
I think the reflex to assert what is true is understandable, but it fundamentally misunderstands the problem of disinformation, because disinformation is about feelings leading to behavior. And the reason that platforms would rather not have that conversation is because what they are selling to advertisers is access to behavior. They're not selling the ability to share some content, they're sharing access to behavior. And as long as platforms exist that make it easy to have access to people's behavior and feelings, you will see disinformation and you will see the manipulation of those things, whether it's to purchase a new set of Tupperware or to make certain voting decisions. And so I see fact-checking as interesting and in some sense, perhaps, important, partly for our academic reflex that truth be spoken somewhere in the context of lies, perhaps partly a dead end for actually addressing this.
Okay, forget about fact-checking, but if I know more about mechanisms like confirmation bias, or precisely the mechanisms by which my emotions are being manipulated, if I can be trained, in those fields, and this is kind of an expanded version of critical thinking, I guess, do you think that would help? Or training individuals is kind of not so efficient because the platform is built this way and the incentives you just described will always push people to this certain direction?
So here's a fun analogy that I think can be based on some evidence. So there's this problem called phishing, and we all know, or we think we know, what phishing looks like, right? The thing is, as we also know, it's incredibly hard to train people to be resistant to phishing. And the reason is that phishing is just the description of deception. It's just a term for deception. When you run a phishing campaign, and I've done so ethically in the context of consensual investigations of companies' security, you're receiving constant feedback about who clicks on what email. And so what you do is you revise your deception until people click again. Phishing trainings, where you show people a bunch of pictures of phishing and say, here's what it looks like, it looks like this. If you see this, don't do this. The problem is it takes me 5 minutes to craft a new phishing email, but an hour of boring PowerPoint and stale coffee to give people a training for last week's phishing. And I worry that with the critical thinking stuff, we inadvertently put ourselves in a situation where we think, okay, we're going to teach people to be critical thinking enough that they will recognize things and, in some sense, take the right action. But I think in practice, what we know is that it's very easy to create feelings in people that cause them to do actions before they stop and think. And the issue is it creates an impossible cognitive burden when navigating the internet to stop and think for everything that you do. You can't stop and think about every tweet. You couldn't possibly stop and think through every email that you received. And so I go back and forth because it's like what you want to teach people is mindfulness. If you're feeling some strong emotions that make you want to perform an action quickly, hold off. Is it really possible? I don't know. This said, I have a great story. So for years, the Tibetan diaspora in Dharamsala in India was heavily targeted, they still are, by Chinese hackers. And the Chinese hackers were sending them emails bearing malware in attachments. And this is a classic way that the entire group, the Dalai Lama and his people, this is how they communicate, right? You send an email with an attached file, please review the file. So the Chinese hackers had, of course, figured this out and were sending a lot of emails bearing attachments. And what they would do is once they would hack one person's email account, they would use that person's emails, change the recipient names, and then send it to other people. So the emails looked really legit. It's called the replay attack. So the Tibetans were like, how do we defend against this problem? Well, we need to get people to stop sending attachments. It's the only thing that we can do. And this could perhaps only work in a context where you have a bunch of Tibetan Buddhists. But they came up with a campaign called Detach from Attachments.
Works on so many levels.
Detach from attachments. And it worked. And the Chinese hackers were left in the dust because suddenly no one was sending any attachments. They had detached, right? They had exercised their will. It worked until the Chinese hackers figured out what they were doing instead, which was sending links to Google Drive files. And so then they began sending links to Google Drive files. But this idea was like to be the human antivirus, to be the human firewall, to detach from attachments. And it was successful for a couple of years. I think in practice, there may be, in certain situations where everyone's kind of on the same cultural page, things that you can promote like that. But I think it would have to align with lots of other cultural values and other sets of norms that people have. The problem with so much stuff on the internet is that nobody has a deep formative basis of experience about the internet that's other than from the internet right now. It doesn't exist in schools, doesn't exist for us as academics,
I was on social media for a couple of hours just before, this interview.
Yeah.
The number of impressions, the tweets or posts that I see, it's impossible to stay mindful. Do you think the only way is to change the platforms, make them more transparent? I don't know what would be the solution. I know sometimes you described the problem perfectly a few minutes before.
Yeah.
Do you see any kind of solution?
Well, I'm wary of the Karl Marx problem, which is a great diagnosis followed by a questionable prescription. But I think that I have a lot of hope about younger people and education. And I feel like we're all in a situation where, not to just beat this parallel, but where our intellectual immune systems have never really seen this particular kind of pathogen before. And so we're all developing immunity in different ways. And it will look like a herd process. It's going to look like us pushing norms around each other. It'll mean changing, I think, probably how we talk to each other in public forums. It will probably mean a lot of change in education around how information is sought and used. I don't see any magic bullets. Instead, I see this as a multi-generational problem where it's like we have this new technology about information. It's more rapid than anything we've ever seen. And we and it are going to evolve together. And our survival is going to be dependent on us figuring out solutions. So I have confidence in that in the long term. And just like anything else with evolution, I'm just not sure of exactly what new, third eye or arm coming out of our ear is actually going to be evolved into to help us deal with this problem. That said, in the language that is tractable to us now, I think that shifts in the norms that we have around this and the educational norms are probably a good start. In practice, the other thing and the elephant in this giant internet room is that as long as these platforms are effectively in an arms race with our own intellectual defenses, it's going to be very hard for us to solve this problem. Because if you think about what goes on, the survival of the platforms is structured around them continuing to deliver access to our behavior. That's their function. And as long as we are coming up with adaptations that can be identified by the platforms using machine learning, they will work out adaptations to our adaptations. And so I see a long evolutionary arms race. As platforms mature and respond to pressure from governments and regulators, they often begin to implement content moderation and lots of other balancing tools, right? So the initial free-for-all of any given platform over the course of 5 years kind of goes down. As it does, though, the people who, for various reasons, feel or need that they need to be free in their action or are looking for something new and different will then slosh to another platform. And then the cycle of control repeats itself. Not that all this control is good. A lot of it is states trying to claw back access and control to these populations. It does mean, however, that I think that seeing a given platform as sort of the target for your advocacy is very short-sighted.
I was reading a report that UN was recommending a moratorium on the export of privately developed surveillance tools. We kind of lost this battle on social media platforms. There's no way we can control it. Maybe we shouldn't even try to control it, as you're saying, but at least limit or ban these commercial surveillance tools until we figure out how to regulate them, which countries should access, whatnot. And that does not even track, right? Nobody listens to that because that commission, as far as I know, does not have any teeth, that UN commission. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I believe you're referring to a statement by the UN Special Rapporteur, David Kaye, on freedom of expression. I think that Kaye's concern is very valid, and he diagnosed the problem accurately, which is there's been a global proliferation of these technologies for hacking and surveillance. And we have just seen with this proliferation an absolute epidemic of abuse cases with these things. And we can see that right now, governments don't seem to have the ability to control this proliferation, even if they want to. Some don't have the will and others try and fail. I think that Kaye's point is this calls for a moratorium until we can solve it. Now, whether such a moratorium can be implemented, obviously, is a different question of realpolitik, and each state will make its own decisions. I think what he highlighted, though, is something very important, which is politicians shouldn't open the door that they can't close. And those doors are being opened everywhere. And I worry that the coronavirus crisis has accelerated the opening of some of those doors.
These deep packet inspections happening in Turkey with the Turkish telecom infrastructure. So they deployed these devices and they're targeting certain people and they're sending them to some, I guess it's a phishing attempt, right?
It's actually malware, not phishing. What it points to is something interesting, which is a device for surveillance can also become sort of passive surveillance, just for monitoring, can also, and blocking, can be turned into a device to hack people. And a device to target them in a much more invasive way.
So this is being used in Turkish telecom, according to your research.
So our research was from sometime in 2018. What it suggests for your listeners is that, and this is probably something that they already know intuitively, which is if a government that's well-resourced and controls its telecommunications sector wants to hack your telephone or your laptop, they can do that. And they can do that without tricking you into entering your password. They can do that really without you doing much of anything, just going about your normal daily business. And I think that this points to a bigger set of questions, which is, okay, so this is a very serious power for a government to have. Do we trust our governments with this power? Have they shown that they use it in ways that are following values that we have? Or do they use it in ways that are abusive? And part of the problem is that most societies right now are in a situation where their governments have the ability to hack and surveil way out beyond their laws and way out beyond any capacity for judicial oversight. And this creates a problem where if the people who are handling and using that technology can't be trusted or have their own agendas, you will see abuses. It seems to me almost like a principle that if you put a sufficiently sophisticated technology for surveillance into the hands of anybody and don't provide oversight, it'll be abused. In fact, we saw this even with the software NSO's Pegasus. So there was recently a story, as recently as last week, that the software was used by one of its employees to stalk a woman. Not exactly a terrorist or a criminal there, but a totally predictable outcome of providing people with unaccountable and highly invasive surveillance.
These mundane cases, let's say, although I don't think stalking a woman would be considered mundane, but relatively mundane cases would actually, the number of those would overwhelm government abuses even.
I think we know that they do. I think that the volume of cases where there is intimate partner hacking and surveillance is very high. We had something called Neapolitan ice cream. And Neapolitan ice cream was one box of ice cream that had 3 flavors: strawberry, vanilla in the middle, and chocolate. I think of hacking as Neapolitan ice cream. Your strawberry is governments that have a lot of science and technology capacity, universities, people with cryptographic and mathematics backgrounds, who can develop their own technologies for hacking, who don't need to go to the market and buy it. They can do it at home. And this is France, Israel, Russia, the United States, maybe sometimes Turkey, you know? Then your vanilla is governments that don't have that kind of background, but they can use a checkbook to pay for it. So this might be like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, who want to buy their way into very sophisticated hacking. And then the chocolate is the my cousin knows computers approach to hacking. And you might say, well, that chocolate approach, how sophisticated and how effective is that going to be? And the answer is it's surprisingly effective, because it turns out, right, you can patch software to fix bugs, but you cannot patch human behavior. And so much good hacking, whatever form it takes, still leverages vulnerabilities in us, our brains, and our behavior to trick us into clicking on things and otherwise performing actions we shouldn't. And what you see is in each of those bands of ice cream, you see the same kinds of abuses, right? So the chocolate, the my cousin knows computers approach, how do you hack someone with that? Well, you go onto the dark web and you find a remote access Trojan, a rat, and you use it, you trick a person into clicking on a link, and you've infected them and are watching them from your janky desktop computer. A lot of that stuff gets used by men hacking women in the department of vanilla, right? So stuff sold to countries. We know that the government of Panama, the former Panamanian president Martinelli, had Pegasus, and he was using it to spy on his mistress. Every day he would receive a DVD. His driver would bring a DVD. He's listening to his mistress. We know this because Panama sought his extradition from the United States to face charges about the abuse of this. So what I'm referring to is stuff from court papers from an extradition hearing. But then in the nation state side, we know that employees at the National Security Agency were using their techniques to follow women around. And what it just shows is that whatever the technological sophistication, whoever the claimed user is, whoever the claimed developer is, it'll be abused by the same people for the same patterns of things. And if you don't have robust oversight, abuse is guaranteed. Every time I feel bad, I tell myself the same mantra, which is everything is like everything else. And if you think about the internet and what we talk about when we talk about hacking, What we're actually talking about is the use of deception and manipulation to exercise power. This is something that's always been true. Everything that happens on the internet has a parallel in real life in terms that we can understand. But because it's in digital clothing, I think from lawmakers to individuals, we find it hard to recognize those parallels. And so it feels like a new and scary world. And our first reaction is to fall back on our defense mechanisms. I don't fully understand it, or maybe I'm completely monitored anyways, et cetera. But none of that is accurate. In fact, security on the internet is just like everything else. How many locks are on your door of your apartment?
One.
If someone was really determined, they had a battering ram, would they be able to break into your apartment?
Oh, sure.
Of course. And the same is true technologically. If a person has sufficient resources, they can break into your phone. And so what you need to think about is how to raise the cost to an attacker to penetrate your digital life. And the same analogy should be true with disinformation. It's not that anybody can do disinformation. It's that you want to take measures that make it more expensive and more costly to run disinformation operations and to access human behavior.
I don't know. I'm trying to think some practical ways that this could happen.
Let me give you an example. Ban political advertising on social media. I'm not saying do it, but I'm saying if you do that, then you create a situation where in order to do, a manipulative political advertising campaign, you need to register a false organization, it needs to pass certain checks, you need to make an investment into doing it. It doesn't mean that it won't be done. It just means that it's harder to be done, which means that you're pricing out certain actors. The same is true for hacking. For example, people often ask me, oh my God, I'm so vulnerable. What do I do to protect myself? You told me about all these terrifying threats. And the simplest answer is two-factor authentication. That simple step that you can take using a recovery key or a phone app paired with your online account prices out many, many attacking groups. The same is true for WhatsApp. Use a PIN code on your WhatsApp. It makes it a lot harder for some third party to hack you. There are lots of simple steps that we can take to claw back a feeling of agency and control. They're not perfect, but we're not Fort Knox either. And, a team of Ocean's 11 burglars is not coming to our digital house next week, but somebody might rattle the door looking to steal our television. If we can protect against the one, it's already a first start.
It doesn't have to be perfect. But perfect is the enemy of good, right? So we can be good at least.
As we're talking about surveillance in times of coronavirus, people are tempted to give up whatever they need to give up in order to be able to get back to the life as they wanted it. And that's totally normal. We all feel that way. The concern is just we want to make sure that when we go back to our new life, although there may be hundreds of thousands of people-sized tears in our society, we want to go back to the society that we recognize, which is a society that protects and respects the individual and that protects our privacy. Otherwise, we run the risk of losing that feeling of safety and privacy in our personal communications with people who are most intimate with us. And I actually think the time of coronavirus is a good time to have a conversation about privacy because for so many of us, we're having our most intimate conversations digitally. And it's so important that we are able to keep our society and keep our relationships connected. And to have that, we need to feel like we can speak freely. Teşekkür ederim.
Bir şey değil. Once again, thanks to John Scott-Railton. You can follow him on Twitter at JSRailton. This talk was made possible by Switch and Board Podcast Studios, a Washington, D.C.-based production company trying to make quality podcasting as accessible as possible. Casual Intellectual is the English language counterpart to a popular Turkish podcast/blog called Fularsız Entellik. Follow us for more English language content.